The fine-tuning or teleological argument is a common argument used by theists to argue for the existence of God, and it's a pretty powerful argument. The argument focuses on that the conditions that allow for life in the universe can only occur when certain fundamental physical constants are within a very narrow range. If one of many fundamental constants are off slightly, the universe would be unfit for the development of matter, astronomical structures, elemental diversity, or life for that matter. So since these things are so finely tuned, it appears that intelligent designer may have been involved in making sure these things happen so life could occur. Take, for example, the critical density of the universe. In the book The Language of God, Francis Collins explains how finely tuned this is. If the critical density was off by just 1 part in 10 to the 15th power, the universe would either collapse or expand too rapid for stars to form. This degree of precision is like taking $10 trillion in pennies, painting just one red, blindfolding someone, and asking him to pick out the red penny. The odds he will pick out the red penny are 1 in 10 to the 15th power. And this is just one of many characteristics of the universe that reveals extreme fine-tuning. The greatest and most finely tuned discovery to this day is the cosmological constant. While the critical density of the universe is finely tuned to 10 to the 15th power, the cosmological constant is finely tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 120th power. Meaning if the cosmological constant was off by just 1 part in a trillion, the universe would expand too quickly or not fast enough to form stars and allow life to exist. This and other examples is extremely good evidence that a creator had to have his hand in designing the universe. Because when you take all the finely tuned constants and put them together, the odds of them all happening by accident is far beyond exceptionally rare. However, despite this is not proof of God. There are alternative explanations as to why so many things are so finely tuned in the universe, and we theists need to accept that. Daniel Dennett, for example, has argued the multiverse theory, which states that it is possible there are countless other universes in addition to our own. Each universe has different properties, different laws, and different values of the basic constants of physics. And given countless other universes, Dennett thinks all the possible distributions of values over the cosmological constants would have been tried out. As it happens, we find ourselves in the one universe where the constants are such as to allow for the development of life. And this explanation could be true and explain why everything appears to be finely tuned. However, there is no guarantee that the process, which produces endless amounts of universes, would randomly set all the parameters in a way that every possibility is realized. It could be that there are constraints on the characteristics of these many universes, and the production process itself would have to be finely tuned in some way to guarantee that we get enough variety of universes. Also, suggesting there is an infinite number of universes just to explain our own is contrary to Occam's razor, which is the principle that says the best explanation is the one that makes the fewest assumptions. Arguing there is an endless amount of universes makes far more assumptions than arguing for an intelligent designer. Richard Swinburne says, "It is the height of irrationality to postulate an infinite number of universes, never causally connected with each other, merely to avoid the hypothesis of theism. Given that simplicity makes for prior probability, and a theory is simpler the fewer entities it postulates, it is far simpler to postulate one God than an infinite number of universes, each differing from each other in accord with regular formula, uncaused by anything else." So there are problems with the multiverse theory, but Alvin Plantinga has noticed something else about it. He has demonstrated in the form of an analogy. It goes like this. Imagine yourself at a poker game. One of the other players is dealing the cards, and for the past 20 hands, he has dealt himself 4 aces each turn. After the last hand, you and the other players get up ready to shoot the guy. But suddenly the dealer says, "I know it looks suspicious, guys, but possibly there is an infinite succession of universes, so that for any possible distribution of possible poker hands, there is a universe in which that possibility is realized. We just happen to find ourselves in the one where someone like me always deals himself only aces and wild cards without ever cheating. It could be the case you can't prove I'm cheating." So if you were at the game, how would you respond? Would you sit back down and assume that could be the case and keep playing? Or would you recognize that possibility is exceptionally rare, and it is far more likely the dealer is cheating? That it is far more likely intelligence was used in instituting where the cards are going, and it is not random chance that the aces keep ending up in the dealer's hand. That is exactly the same idea behind the fine-tuning argument. In everyday life, when we encounter situations that seem to be rigged, we do not assume it is chance. We know intelligent design when we see it. It could be the case that it is just random chance, but we know the odds are never in that favor. So when we encounter odds like the ratio of electromagnetic force to gravity being finely tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 40th power, or the cosmological constant being finely tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 120th power, logically we shouldn't say, well, it's possible by accidental chance there is a trillion universes, and we just happen to be in the one that is capable of producing life. Especially when we encounter odds that high in a possible situation in life, like a poker game, we wouldn't believe it is just random chance. So although the fine-tuning argument cannot prove the existence of an intelligent designer, it shows us that the existence of God is far more logical than everything just happening by random chance. The only other possibilities as to why the universe is so finely tuned is physical necessity or chance. Now we know it is not because of physical necessity, meaning they are determined by the laws of nature, because there is no connection between the laws of nature and the finely tuned constants of the universe. The physicist Paul Davies notes that there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever the universe had to have the set of physical constants it does. But also, if the universe was finely tuned due to physical necessity, this would mean that a life-prohibiting universe is impossible. But a life-prohibiting universe is entirely probable and logically coherent. Skeptics would need to demonstrate that a life-prohibiting universe is incompatible with the laws of physics, but this just isn't the case, and leading physicists accept this. Which is why the idea that the universe is finely tuned due to physical necessity has very few, if any, supporters. So this means the universe has either been finely tuned by design, or is just a lucky chance. So in order to avoid the design hypothesis, many skeptics will argue that we are here by chance, and say the weak anthropic principle is an explanation, which is simply an argument that if the laws were not finely tuned for a life-permitting universe, we would not be here to observe it in the first place. Basically, skeptics are sort of resorting to a nonchalant shrugging of the shoulders and saying, because we exist, the laws of nature must clearly be compatible with life, so the odds that we find ourselves in a life-permitting universe is 1 in 1. However, the philosopher John Leslie responds to this with an analogy. He says, imagine you're facing a firing squad. You hear the command to fire, and then the sound of gunshots, and then silence. You are not dead, and all the highly trained marksmen missed. Leslie argues taking this stance is analogous to surviving a firing squad and saying, of course all the shots miss me, otherwise I wouldn't be here to notice that I'm still alive. A much more logical approach would be to find an explanation as to why such an unlikely event occurred. But according to this explanation by skeptics, you should not be surprised by the high improbability of the fine-tuning of the universe, because you are alive to observe it. However, to be clear, this would not be our reaction if a similar thing happened, like that of the firing squad analogy. We'd want to seek out an explanation as to why. Whereas the argument that the weak anthropic principle is an explanation does nothing to offer any kind of resolution. Which is why cosmologists have come out in agreement with John Leslie. Martin Rees says in his paper, one hard-headed response is that we couldn't exist if the laws had boring consequences. We manifestly are here, so there is nothing to be surprised about. I'm afraid this leaves me unsatisfied. I'm impressed by a well-known analogy given by the philosopher John Leslie. Even Richard Dawkins has changed his view and now agrees with John Leslie.
I agree with those who don't find that totally satisfying. The philosopher John Leslie expresses his dissatisfaction with it by imagining a man facing a firing squad, and there are 10 men in the firing squad. They all aim their rifles at him. The rifles will go off and he finds himself still alive. And so he says to himself, well, obviously the rifles all missed, because otherwise I wouldn't be here. But that leaves unexplained why the rifles all missed. You still feel you need an explanation.
He goes on to argue the multiverse is the reason the universe is so finely tuned. But as we have already shown in our previous video, that idea is unreasonable and violates Occam's razor. So arguing the weak anthropic principle as an explanation is an overwhelmingly rejected response to the teleological argument. However, despite this, many skeptics still argue like this without even realizing it. A common objection layman skeptics use is to say that high improbabilities happen on a daily basis, so the fine-tuning of the universe should not be considered unlikely. They often use examples like, what are the odds you would pick any random sequence of cards out of a deck? For example, the odds you would pick out these 4 cards is 1 in over 7 million. so astronomically improbable things happen all the time. So this is pretty much like the traditional way to argue, in that it is a nonchalant shrugging of the shoulders and saying, well, high improbabilities happen all the time, therefore we should not be surprised by the high improbability of the finely tuned constants. However, this is simply a mischaracterization of the argument. The fine-tuning argument doesn't simply argue high improbability, it argues high improbability with what results from it. When you take a random order of cards out of a deck, nothing happens. There is no special potentiality that makes a difference. There is no complexity, no order, no creation of atoms, no creation of massive stars or galaxies. There is nothing incredibly odd that needs explained. Taking random high improbabilities that produce nothing meaningful seems odd to compare to the fine-tuning argument, as they are completely different based on context of what is happening. On one hand, a massive universe containing billions of galaxies is formed, which is filled with integrative complexity and utter beauty, and on the other hand, cards get laid out that mean nothing and have no potentiality. But furthermore, these counter-arguments against the teleological argument still fail to explain why the universe is so finely tuned, and expect us to sit around in ignorance and not seek out the most rational inference as to why the universe is so finely tuned. This is like surviving an execution by firing squad and saying, well, you know, high improbabilities happen all the time, so the odds that I'm still alive really don't need explained. A good logical explanation satisfies curiosity, whereas this kind of explanation doesn't offer anything and seems it is trying to avoid the conclusion. Finally, many skeptics argue that since we have no universes to compare our own against, we cannot say if the universe was finely tuned or not. We would need to evaluate the constants of other universes to see how improbable ours really is. Therefore, we cannot say our universe is finely tuned because we lack others to compare it with. Well, this objection is simply arguing that an absence of evidence somehow refutes the evidence that we do have and what we currently know, which is that the universe does not have to have the physical constants because of physical necessity. Robin Collins points out that the naturalistic perspective would not predict a uniform distribution of values of constants. So other possible universes with slightly different constants are entirely probable, and the leading physicists agree with this. Plus, the physicist Paul Davies notes that there is no good reason to think there could have been minor variations to our universe and still exist as is. So there is also no evidence to suggest other universes could exist with slightly different constants and still support life. Arguing this way is like surviving an execution by firing squad and saying, well, we really don't know how improbable this event is since we cannot observe my execution in a parallel world. So all the evidence we do have concludes our universe is unlikely and requires an extreme amount of fine-tuning. Arguing we need a probability distribution is simply a way to try and brush over the evidence we do have. There is no good evidence to think our universe doesn't require extreme fine-tuning. So when these arguments are looked at more closely, we can easily see that it doesn't explain anything or even offer a rational conclusion. They merely try to get us to not find an answer for the high improbability of our universe existing and the extreme fine-tuning it required. Any rational person will find these arguments pointless and will actually seek out the most rational inference as to why the universe is so finely tuned. Hiding behind the weak anthropic principle is merely an attempt to hide from the most obvious conclusion.